some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
You
palpable.
don't ever say to her that
What about the Chautauqua Institute?
Introductory discussion on the ethical implications of a community.
We're trying to take back over.
Currently doing in autism.
Immigration is one of the most controversial topics of the past decade, and while ordinary citizens and pundits from across the political spectrum argue for major and different changes to American immigration law, few people know what American immigration law actually is and how it functions. Victor Romero is a highly respected immigration law scholar with more than a passing interest in the topic. Born in the Philippines, Romero is now a distinguished scholar and professor of law at Penn State. He's the former president of the South Central Pennsylvania chapter of the ACLU and has written extensively on the subject of immigrant and minority rights as well as immigration. Here's our conversation with Victor Romero. Victor Romero, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
When it comes to immigration, legal or illegal, Americans are divided. Why are we so divided?
I think that's a terrific question. And if you look at our immigration history, we have long valued the fact that the United States is a country of immigrants, right? We all value and we all have stories about how our forefathers came, whether it's from Europe or Asia or Latin America, to this country and made something of ourselves. In fact, that's something that we hold dear, the promise of America. On the other hand, it seems to me that every so often, as we go through the cycle of our history, there are points in time where a certain group of people become fearful of immigration. And to me, it stems from the part of our human nature, which is to fear that which we don't understand or don't believe in or don't really completely comprehend. And so both of these ideas, the one about America being a country of immigrants and the other about being fearful for that which we don't know, are part of our history leading to a very schizophrenic attitude about immigration.
Going back to President Clinton, he referred to immigration frequently as this element that invigorated, energized our country. And yet now, as you said, people look at immigration, legal and illegal, with colored glasses. They are a little afraid of it.
I think that's absolutely right. And if you take a look at our history again, though, it's pretty clear that the troughs, if you will, or the periods of time where we're afraid of immigration or more skeptical or want to limit immigration, whether it's legal or undocumented, tend to coincide with periods in our history where there's turmoil or an economic downturn. And so it's not surprising to me that, especially now when things are hard for U.S. workers, and I'm not just talking about U.S. citizens, but legal permanent residents, those who are here with green cards who are allowed to work. So it's not surprising to me that there are people who would rather be cautious on the immigration front.
And in fact, polls today indicate that Americans want less immigration, legal and illegal immigration in this country, which leads me to this question. Nothing is all good and all bad. On one hand, we hear about illegal immigration as putting a strain on the economy, on schools, on health care. On the other hand, we look at it as a necessary flow of labor into the country. That may have changed with the decline in our own economy. But talk, if you would, about the benefits and challenges of illegal immigration.
Of undocumented migration, absolutely. On the one hand, I think that's true, that the best economic evidence regarding undocumented migration is that it has a disproportionately bad impact upon lower skilled U.S. workers. And so if you are a U.S. worker and you happen to be in an industry where you're not talking about sort of white collar industry, undocumented migration tends to depress wages in those industries. On the other hand, you hear a lot of stories that talk, and I remember talking to people who own farms, for example, or who manage farm workers, and they talk about time and again not having enough people to bring in the harvest. And so I think there's a real tension there. Some thoughtful advocates on this particular issue suggest, for example, a robust guest worker program where you track people to come, for example, in an industry where they need laborers, for example, the farm industry, and make sure that those laborers are paid decent wages, that those wages don't depress the wages of the U.S. workers working in the field, and that there's a good flow in and out of the country. And so I think that those are the kinds of strategies that we should be looking at in order to strike that fair balance.
Well, in terms of strategies, in Utah, they're talking about just what you said, allowing people to come in, work, and go back over the border. Some who have suggested that are getting hate mail, death threats. I guess what I'm getting at is that the discourse over this has gotten palpably unfriendly, more unfriendly than it seems ever in recent history.
Well, and that's a fair point. At least in my experience, and I've been teaching immigration law for over 10 years now, to me, the sort of seminal point in my career anyway, in terms of when I saw the tide turning, was in 2004. I had given an interview for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette where I suggested that this program, which was meant to stop terrorism on patrol, that was the name of the program, and the way the program worked was that it would authorize local Pennsylvania state troopers to stop people who are driving on Pennsylvania highways and ask them for their documents. Very similar to the kinds of laws that we hear in Arizona and elsewhere. And what I suggested was that, first of all, there might be a problem in terms of whether the federal government should be handling this or the state government. And then second of all, do we really know whether the police would be able to tell that people they're stopping were undocumented or not? I don't think I would have a problem if every single person who was stopped was asked for documents. At least you can say then that the police officers were treating each and every motorist in the same way.
Of course, that would be untenable.
That's right.
Everybody.
In other words, and that's why I suggest that, to plant the seed in people's mind that is this something that we would prefer as an alternative, but instead we try to single people out. And that's why in Arizona, for example, a couple of the lawsuits that were actually filed were brought by police officers. Arizona police officers who said, you know, we really can't do this without using race as a way of profiling people who may or may not be undocumented.
What do you see as the problems of immigration law becoming a vehicle for combating terrorism? Is that a problem?
I think it is a problem because it hasn't been effective. In other words, if we had been able to use immigration law and say that there is a tight nexus between immigrants and terrorists, then I would say we should use it. But all the data and all the studies that have been done post 9/11, especially, so in our most recent history, have suggested that there really isn't much of a tie between whether one is an immigrant and whether one is a terrorist. And we can think of a number of counterexamples. The one that comes up a lot of times is Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing. And there's someone who was a U.S. citizen born and bred, and yet he was someone who was a terrorist. And in fact, the research suggests that in terms of criminality generally, native-born citizens are actually more likely to be criminal than immigrants. So I just don't see how that helps us.
Well, you said one of the things is we look at Bill Gates as a white American, and yes, he may not be stopped, but he may be treated the same way the American Taliban, Eric Walker Lind, is that the correct name?
Yes, that's
was
right.
treated.
That's right. So again, so part of it depends on what kinds of proxies we're willing to use for certain types of behaviors. In other words, as a society, we think that certain behaviors are bad, and it's good that we do. We think that criminality is bad. We think that terrorism is bad. But the danger becomes when we start substituting status or things that people can't change, like race, gender, or things that we don't want them to change, like their religion, and opine from that or infer from that that these kinds of statuses lead us to believe that these people are dangerous or criminals.
And that's where we get to the burden of the enemy race.
I think that's absolutely right. If you think about our long, long history, and if you think about immigration law in particular, it's not unusual that whatever group has been in power has tended to be skeptical about newcomers coming in. Again, it's part of our human nature. And so when the Irish came in after that great potato famine, there were rumblings among the states at the time and in Congress to possibly limit immigration. When the Chinese came in, they were brought in to help advance the building of the transcontinental railway. And after that was built, there were fears that they might take over the west coast of the United States especially. And palpably, they were a perceived threat to the Easterners who were moving into the West to settle the region. And so Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. In the 1950s, we saw this again with the fear over communism and the Cold War. And there were several notable Supreme Court opinions in which people who were longtime residents of the United States who happened to have left the United States for a short period of time and upon return were excluded.
To go home to see an ailing relative, for example.
That's right. Were then excluded because they were viewed to be a threat. One of the opinions in specific talked about going behind the Iron Curtain and suggesting that that was something to be afraid of. And then, of course, there's the internment of the Japanese and Japanese Americans during World War II that was upheld by the court in Korematsu. So throughout our history, there have been many examples of the exclusion of the other, a lot of which was based on race or ideology.
And still arguments over whether the internment of the Japanese during World War II, whether it was justified or not. There's a new book in defense of internment by Michelle Malkin, who happens to be of Philippine descent. She happens to believe that it was right then and it's right now.
Yes, and Ms. Malkin and I do share the fact that we're both from the Philippines, but probably the similarities end there. I couldn't disagree with Ms. Malkin more. Congress, as you know, recognized that the internment was illegal and issued an apology. But interestingly, I think that the arguments in favor
But did it keep us safer?
That's right. I think interestingly, there is no concrete evidence to suggest that it did. If you think about what happened during that time, the Italian Americans and German Americans were individually screened for the most part. There were pockets where they were detained for a little bit of time, but there was not this mass incarceration or exclusion of the population just as we did with the Japanese. And then similarly, if we think about post 9/11 and our treatment of people from Muslim and Arab nations, there is no evidence to suggest that that broad sweep that we did following 9/11 has produced any terrorists that we can account for.
But I think you recognize that there need to be limits on how many people can come to the United States. And in fact, more people have immigrated to the United States than all other countries combined in the last 50 years.
And that is a wonderful thing about this country, and I think that's a great promise of this country. Obviously, we can't accept everybody who wants to come here, but that also doesn't take into account that most people actually want to stay where they are. If we just think about our own experiences, the experiences of our friends, it's very difficult to move from one's home. And it takes a great amount of either push or pull from either the sending state or the receiving state for a person to give up everything they hold dear, their culture, their family, their ties, to come to a very different nation. I mean, I just think about my own experience, and while I was happy to immigrate for the purposes of
You were 19 years old.
I was 19 years old, and I was excited about coming to school here. I had always intended to go back home. And I remember when I became a naturalized citizen, they have you swear an oath, which I think is very important. But part of the oath, having gone to law school, I read it closely, part of the oath asked you to renounce all foreign potentates. Well, that was a bit difficult to do because it's not like I had a fear that if there ever was a war between the United States and the Philippines, I wouldn't sign up with the U.S. Army. I think the concern was I have a very strong affiliation for my home country. So even with respect to people who come here voluntarily, I think that people still retain ties with their home countries, and that's important.
Talk a little bit about your interest in the law. Your interest is in American immigration and constitutional law. That sounds like a very complex thing. The Constitution on its own is a complex thing to look at, and immigration, as you know, is equally complex. What is this new field of constitutional immigration law?
Well, let me try to break it down for you and state it quite simply. The thing that fascinates me about the U.S. Constitution is that on the one hand, it suggests that there are differences between U.S. citizens and non-U.S. citizens. And I appreciate that. If you think about the 14th Amendment, it sets that out with respect to birthright citizenship. And all nations of the world have some sort of division between citizens and non-citizens. So that's not too unique. On the other hand, the 14th Amendment, the 5th Amendment also contain clauses within them that apply to persons, not citizens, but persons. For example, and this is where I'm really interested in the Constitution, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment says that no state shall deny any person the equal protection of the law. Well, what does that mean with respect to our treatment of non-citizens within our midst? There's a real tension there between the clauses that say we can draw distinctions between citizens and non-citizens, and the clauses that say we're going to treat all persons equally in terms of due process and in terms of equal protection. And how this applies on the ground is interesting. NPR actually is just doing a series on how we've criminalized border crossings and what that means today. It means that we're spending a lot of money having these mass hearings where judges come in, lawyers are appointed, and apparently they can't figure out how much money this is costing, but charging these people who cross the border with a crime so as to effectively deter them from coming back. Now, if someone is very desperate, though, because their situation's so bad in their home country, one has to wonder whether the costs outweigh the benefits and whether, in fact, President Obama and some others in Congress who are suggesting another way of doing this, actually legalizing some people, might be the answer.
Well, in fact, you say we should decriminalize international border crossings into the United States, and in the same breath, you say that would be taking enforcement seriously. People, I'm sure, are scratching their heads on that one.
Yeah. And what I mean by that is this. We already have within our immigration law system a way to handle people who cross the borders. So, for example, let's draw an analogy to speeding, right? Most people who get a speeding ticket get exactly that, a speeding ticket. That doesn't have any more weight than, in terms of our criminal law system. We don't treat that the same way as we treat shoplifting or as we treat murder or other serious crimes. Why can't we handle immigration law the same way? Now, there might be some people who say, well, that's not going to deter enough people, right? But if you think about the way that we have militarized the border region, I think that crossing the Sonora Desert, where hundreds of people have died over the last decade, is enough of a deterrent, I think, to most reasonable people. And yet, there are many people who still feel that doing the cost benefit, it's still worth it for them to cross.
You're saying that the punishment should fit the crime, and you think that crossing over the border, while it's against the law, isn't a crime the way we're punishing it?
That's right. If you think about the history of this, actually, we didn't criminalize border crossings until 1929, which means, as a federal matter, which means that prior to that, we didn't really care about whether this was a crime or not. And we send a signal, don't we, when we criminalize a certain act. So what is it about crossing the border that makes it necessarily a criminal act? And that's the issue that I would like us to address. In other words, are there ways, as you say, to make that particular act manageable under current law without saying that that's necessarily a crime? I think it should be a crime if you can show that there's some other criminal activity afoot. For example, the smuggling of weapons or the trafficking of human beings. I think those things are things that people
What do you think would
about.
happen, though, if we decriminalized border crossings in terms of the flow of people from Mexico and other border states?
I think that wouldn't necessarily be a problem if, in addition to decriminalization, we had a more robust, for example, guest worker program, or tried to deal with the idea of people crossing the border to work, which is what most people do. So you mentioned Utah earlier. What a wonderful example, right? You've got in Utah people in power who are primarily Republican, Latino, and Mormon. That's sort of the people who have come to the table around this issue. And you can expect that with respect to those three constituent groups, there actually would be a lot of divergence in terms of political views. And yet, they recognize that most people come to this country from the southern border because they want to work, and they'd like to find a viable state solution to that that would work both for the economy of Utah and for the migrants who want to be able to do work. So I think it's possible, it's just that we don't imagine it to be.
And what's also happening in Utah is a group of women got together and made a list of what they thought were 1,300 illegal alien women expecting children, reported that to the authorities, asked for their immediate deportation, and that really changed the entire conversation, I think perhaps because it put a face on who we're talking about?
I think that's right. If you think about the perspectives on immigration law that people tend to hold, roughly speaking, you can divide folks into one of two camps. There are folks who believe that immigration law should just be about numbers, that all we need to do is take a look at what the United States needs are, figure out how many legal immigrants we can absorb and cap it at that. On the other hand, there are those who say, but behind those numbers are people. And so these stories about people who are actually doing the work, people who are actually have relationships with US citizen spouses, as I do, and that's how I came over, or with children, those are the sort of stories that really make us think hard about the kinds of choices we're making as a nation.
I think what a lot of people are afraid of is that states, because of federal inaction, are creating this patchwork of immigration law. Who ultimately, in your opinion, should be the person or the entity that decides immigration policy in this country?
I think even though if you take a look back at our history, the states before the founding were in charge of that particular idea. Now that we have chosen to be a United States of America, that has to be within the federal government. And if we just think about it as a practical matter, when the United States presents itself as a sovereign nation and in dealing with other nation states, it has to present itself with one voice. We can't have 50 different states with their own immigration laws telling people from other countries whether they can come in or not. So just as a practical matter, I don't see how we can do that any differently.
There's talk of fences, border control, enforcing the laws that are on the books. In terms of approaches, what do you think is the most practical?
I'm not sure that any of those are really practical. It just depends, I suppose, on your point of view. We were talking earlier about laws that make people safer or less safe. I suppose that if there was a real concern, and apparently there is at the border, that there is danger afoot because of human trafficking or smuggling or weapons and violence at the border, I think that should be addressed. But in terms of just the movement of people, I don't know why we don't take the same approach that we did, for example, with respect to the free trade of goods and services that we did with NAFTA, the free trade agreement. The free trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico allows for the free movement of goods, but why not people? And I appreciate—
So they would come and work in the United States and then go back home at night?
And in fact, actually, some people do that already. We have, and I know this with respect to a specific type of visa, we actually have a visa for people who want to study, for example, right across the border. So someone who lives in a border town in Mexico can go to school in Texas and come back at night and has a visa that allows them to do that. So I think part of it is just what we are willing to imagine in terms of possibilities. And again, taking into account where the real threats come from.
I want to close with this. Ultimately, I think this discussion about immigration, legal and illegal, is a political, economic, and moral issue.
That's right.
How do you think this is going to shake out?
Only time will tell, Patty. I'm hoping that the more reasonable voices might be heard such that we think about the consequences of how we handle this legally. And what I mean is exactly this. If we have a situation where there are two possible outcomes, one possible outcome would be to say, well, we're going to look at it just in terms of numbers and in terms of the U.S. interests. We know that we'll be protecting them by saying we're going to limit immigration in this sort of way. The second possible outcome, though, is that if we pass a law this way, we actually might have really horrible effects upon people on the ground, everyday people like you and me who are trying to better their lives by coming to the United States. And if the question is, where do we put that kind of pressure, and on which side do we err, I would hope that we err on the side of protecting or giving the benefit of the doubt to the people on the ground who might actually be affected adversely by the law.
Why should we do that?
Well, because I think that that's something that we understand as human beings. I think the reason that we tend to think of immigrants as being different is because we tend not to think about them as being us, or we tend not to think about them as being part of our story. But as you said earlier, the idea of immigration is an American story, and that at heart we are all people who really need to who have come to the United States to try to make lives better for ourselves.
Victor Romero, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Victor Romero. Comcast subscribers can watch this program anytime on Penn State On Demand. Find out how through our website, conversations.psu.edu, where you'll find more information on immigration as well as an excerpt from Victor Romero's book, Alienated. I'm Patty Satalia. Join us for our next Conversation from Penn State.
If you've enjoyed Conversations from Penn State and would like to purchase a DVD of this show or any of our other episodes, order online at mediasales.psu.edu or call 1-800-770-2111.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you. This has been a production of WPSU.